go. Hello and welcome to Ananke's Women in Literature Festival 2022. This is the digital and soft launch and introduction to Naveen Kishore's book, Knotted Grief, which is being translated by Hamad Rind here. I'll very briefly introduce our panelists. We have here, well, not necessarily in order of seniority, but in order of experience. So we'll go with Naveen Kishore, who is the publisher and founder of Seagull Books. He has just come out with a lovely book of poetry called Knotted Grief. Then we have with us Hamad Rind, a translator and author of Four Dervishes, published by Seren Books in Wales. He has very generously agreed to translate Naveen's work into Urdu. I think this is the first of its kind where a book from India is coming, and it's a book of poetry and it's been translated into Urdu. Normally it's the other way around. And we have also here with us my dear friend and colleague and fellow publisher, Tayyiba Abbas. Tayyiba has just come out with a book called The Night in Her Hair, and she is the founder of Ala Books, a new publishing house based in Lahore. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. We've all had quite an extraordinary morning.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, Meher. Good to be.
We did, yes.
Now, I'm just going to dive straight in here. Naveen, you've written this book of poetry, and it addresses many issues. There's the core is, of course, the issue of Kashmir, and yet you go beyond the political, you transcend all of that, and you're looking at it from a very human perspective. What were you thinking when you were writing this? And you focus a lot on the flaws of humanity and how those flaws and what makes us human is very much the essence of your work. You're not looking to sort of put forward solutions or any perfect ideals.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of dailiness, first of all, the whole process of writing, which I've been doing for years. And the book came together fairly accidentally because I'm in that strange space where I write every day. So it's a bit like riyaz, you like music, you practice. Of course, everybody wants to be published, but one never thinks about it consciously, at least I don't. And I can't publish my own books. So you wait to be discovered. But you don't have a manuscript. You don't have because you're so busy writing. So it happened accidentally because an Australian publisher discovered some of my writing in some American journal. And then I was forced to put together an initial draft of poems, and I chose the Kashmiriyat because for me, it's not just the political situation we've never been able to solve, but it's also a human condition. It could be anywhere in the world. It could be your part of the world, it could be Syria, it could be Palestine, Rwanda. The human condition that is undergoing this sort of sense of constantly being under siege. So I'm not reporting from the streets of any war-torn situation. I'm dealing, therefore, the human condition, which also comes with its flip side, a certain kind of hope. So the poems come, I hope, from a space of darkness, an almost welcoming space of darkness, but there is a kind of everybody who responds to it tends to feel that there is some hope somewhere. But it also has the other side, which is grief, which is about, it stems from losing two mothers, mine, of course, but also more recently, the mother of a very dear colleague who was very close to me. So it's very strange that a very intimate set of losses become national grief in the political sense when you link it to the whole Kashmir thing. So it was kind of put together like that. I don't know if I've directly answered your question, but that's
No, you most certainly have. Now, Hamad, before I come to you to ask about how you feel about translating, Tayyiba, I'd like to ask you your thoughts. Pakistan has been through many upheavals, and what Naveen is talking about, grief, I think every other day, at least I do anyway, I'm sort of, getting upset or hurt over something that has happened, or the loss of life or something or the other. And yet I haven't seen that much work that has sort of executed this or explored this concept of grief. I think the most visible expression of grief is perhaps during Muharram, when we see the minority Shia sect come forward and everyone sort of joins in somehow or the other in their own way, even if they're not Shia or not even Muslim. But I haven't come across this sort of poetry which is addressing grief in same concept as Naveen has said. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Meher, for asking that question. And can everyone hear me? I hope my connection is.
Yes, yes.
I don't know if I'd really be able to answer that question as I should, because I can only answer it from a very personal place, because we are talking about poetry, right? And before we went live, I was telling Naveen, I don't really know what kind of conversation we are going to have, because we talk about poetry, we talk around poetry, but how can we, poetry is at the center of it, is at the heart, but what do we do with it?
Sure.
You know, so I don't know if I can answer questions or ask questions, but I'm here to listen. I'm here to share the thoughts that Naveen's work stirred inside me, and hoping those thoughts will reconnect back with him and with all of you. Now, you know, poetry, and Naveen, I want to say this, I admire your courage. And I say this to every poet, because poetry is a place where there's no place to hide, you know, and yet it's a place where we all want to be, where we all need to be. Now, you've written about such, I really don't know what word to use to describe your work, but you know, there's grief, there's so much pain, there's devastation, there's death, there's mourning, there's overcoming it, there's haunting, there's so much haunting, you know. And those words, that music, those stories belong to everyone. The stories of displacement, stories of resistance, they will belong to everyone personally, they will belong to everyone culturally. But you know, when I read the first section, Kashmiriyat, it spoke to me from a very, very personal place, because I belong to Kashmir. I belong to Srinagar from my mother's side of the family. And I've never been to Srinagar, naturally. I don't know if I'll ever visit Srinagar, if I'll ever see my family home, which still stands there. It's called Gulshan in Srinagar. And, you know, now, it's difficult for me to talk about this. I don't know if I will be able to talk about it. I'll just move around it very, very vaguely. But poetry is something that saved me at a time in my life when I was really just falling over a cliff. This was, it's been 12 years now. I was miles away from home. I was in another country. I was at university, and I was all alone. And I was overcoming my grief. I was trying to come to terms with my personal loss. And at that time, like, you know, things just happen to you. You can't really explain how they happen. It's destiny. Yes, I believe in destiny. I really do. I just, at that point in university, I discovered the poetry of Agha Shahid Ali. It's embarrassing to say I had not read his poetry until then, because I mean, he's family. He was my uncle. It's weird to say it because I never met him. I was around 14 or 15 when he passed away in the States. But so he was family. So I grew up with that feeling, that strange feeling of being related to a poet who's so loved, you know. So it's a strange burden. So I do shy away from talking about this, but I discovered his work because I had to study his work then. He was part of my course. And then I studied, I read about the poetry of the exiled poet, and it's so much in it. But, and I remember even then, Call Me Ismail Tonight. I mean, that ghazal just did something for me, which I'm still in the process of trying to understand. But then through his work, I developed a new love for Shia literature, for Shia poetry. I call it Shia poetry. I mean, the Marsiya, the Noha. And that saved me. It was a way for me to keep communicating with my loss and my grief, but then academically as well. And it's become a passion now, you know. And then through that experience, then I discovered the work of this brilliant person, philosopher, writer, Elaine Scarry, and her book, The Body and Pain, the Making and Unmaking of the World. And in that work, she talks about how pain is not something you can express, communicate, articulate. You just can't, because it goes beyond words. It even goes beyond sound. And that's why we break into sound when we are grieving, when we are in pain. And you know, it's like and there was, quite a few people who were talking about her book, about her work. I mean, this was back then. It's like when you go to a doctor and they're like, and someone is like asking you, like, where does it hurt? How does it hurt? How do you describe it? You know, if anything, you know how to describe it by the level of the sound that you make, you know, how much it hurts. How can you describe something that, you know, that's something that is not tangible, right? How do you describe a pain in your heart, right? I mean, you're alive, you're not dying as such, but it's there and you feel like you're dying. How do you describe it? So
Absolutely.
when I read your poetry, Naveen, it brought all of that back. You know, it was very painful, but very beautiful too, because as she says as well, you know, physical pain leads to the destruction of the world, to put it roughly, the destruction of the world. But then through that destruction, there's beauty as well, because after the destruction of the world, or after the unmaking of the world, there's the making of the world. And that is why perhaps, I mean, whether it's your work or Aga Shahid Ali and so many others all over the world, the most beautiful, the most poignant verse comes out of the most unimaginable pain, the most unimaginable losses. So I don't know if I answered your question, Meher, but the thing is, like,
No,
even,
definitely.
you know, we
Definitely.
hide behind stories. I hide behind stories. I hide behind fiction. Everything that I write, I know will always be a tribute to my father. That was the loss that I was talking about. But I hide behind literature. I hide behind fiction. So that's why I said I admire your courage, Naveen, because with poetry, you know, it's just, there's no hiding. There's no running away. And I don't know how many people have the strength to really do that. It takes a lot of courage.
Thank you. I mean,
Absolutely.
that's very touching. I would just add the word vulnerability, which is something that I've constantly spoken about, that one has to reveal oneself in any public situation in a very vulnerable manner and leave it to the recipient, in this case you, to either squish or to nurture. And what you just did was a wonderful nurturing and connecting with your own, you know, landscape in your head. Thank you.
Hamad, sorry, Sabine, you had something to say, please.
How do I follow with this? I'm, you know, you've taken my breath away, Tayyiba. Truly. With your vulnerability and rawness. But I wanted to, Naveen, you spoke about the title Kashmiriyat, and you know, when I first opened the book, the first page that I saw, you know, and it said, wearing a transparent shadow, the young widow waits and waits. And then the next page is Kashmiriyat. What does that title mean to you? Because is that, because I felt it is an emotion, it is a feeling, and it's not about Kashmir. It's about loss. It's about the pain, the pain that we all feel. So yeah.
Yeah, just as I said at the beginning, that to me, it isn't about Kashmir alone. It is the human condition. So the Kashmirians, in that sense, depends on where you are. You either embrace it as a way of life, right? It is almost second skin in that sense. And in the same way, I used to talk about the fact that I come from the theater, and I would loosely, if I was meeting Taiba for the first time, Ahmad, then I would very quickly, my mental math would place them as theater people, non-theater people. That simply meant in my head, कि भाई इनको trust कर सकते हैं कि नहीं. They may never have done theater in their life, but if you felt connected in the nicest possible way, because there was a certain humanity that came through, because theater teaches you the humane, it teaches you the solving of the human condition using simple indigenous, whatever is available, either emotion or material, to create something. So for me, Kashmiriya, therefore, is a kind of broad umbrella, at the same time, a very intimate something we carry with us, regardless of whether we lose our homes or seek refuge elsewhere. It's like I've always said, I carry the idea of home in my head. In the same way, because I grew up there. I, in fact, discovered, I write about the fact often that I discovered language of a certain kind to communicate, to articulate during my early days in Kashmir. And that's a whole different book, so to speak. But and then remain connected in different ways throughout. And we do a lot of work with the conflict zones there, with young people who we get to Calcutta as part of our Peaceworks program, just so they can see a certain ordinary life, you know. So that too is Kashmiriyat, the act of reaching out back and forth through, you know, whatever connections. So people of, you know, but in today's very fraught, toxic world, you can be accused of, "Ki bhai, tum kaun ho Kashmir ke baare mein likhne mein?"
No, absolutely. And I think you hit a nerve there with the idea of finding a home. I mean, Hamad, you and I both belong to the diaspora. And I think while you have a more stronger sense of belonging, in my case, I still seek a home. And again, the whole process of grieving, at least for like myself, I come from a Shia background, the whole reenactment, Naveen, like you said, that's the whole idea of Muharram. It's you know, contrary to popular belief, we don't worship all of it. It's just sort of reenactment. It's a very theatrical, dramatic thing. Hamad, how do you feel about it as a translator? You know, you see grief manifesting in different forms, or as Naveen has said, the Kashmiriyat, which is like a state of being. And yet, from a translator's perspective, where you're working with language and words, how do you feel about that? Do you think that it's different from reenactment and then theater, or do you think that ultimately it's basically the same thing? Like it's the end is the same. The message is what matters.
Yeah, thank you very much, Meher. And thank you for having me today. And really glad to be part of this. When you first came to me with the proposal, I really loved it. And there were many reasons behind that, you know, one being a collaboration between India and Pakistan, but also that the title itself, Not It Grieve, and that part, grief, yeah, that just gripped me. And just like yourself, I come from a similar background, both in terms of being in diaspora, being away from home, trying to find a home for myself. You know, home is a very elusive word, and it's not just a physical place; it's a mental place as well. But also from my Shia background as well, and as you said, you know, it's not just in terms of enactment. In language, we express our grief. We make use of language a lot, and some of the most beautiful poetry, arguably, has been written in Urdu, in the Marsiya form that Taiba mentioned as well earlier, Marsiya or elegy, and not just in Urdu. I think if you look at the Shia tradition, the Marsiya form in Shia tradition, all over the world, in my view, Urdu, Saraiki, and Persian are the three languages which have expressed it really beautifully, which have tried to capture it in so many different ways, because it's you know, it's an incident that goes back to 1400 years ago, and we are still we commemorate that every year, and it's something that I forget that that's very difficult to explain to someone who doesn't come from that background. The other day, if you allow me to, you know, just diverge on this little anecdote. The other day, I was talking to a friend from Bulgaria about this, and I was explaining it, and I was saying that, you know, it happened 1400 years ago, and how much catharsis that the grief element offers us when we go through it every year. And, you know, it was very difficult for her to imagine and to relate to that. That's something that happened so long ago in you know, history, still offers us that sort of thing. So you know, there's that as well, that element, definitely. But also, you know, Kashmir, which is, I think, anyone who comes from the subcontinent, or at least from Pakistan and India, has some sort of, even if they don't have a direct connection to Kashmir, they know about it. They know about it in a very emotional way usually. So that was another reason why I really liked the project. And when I read it, I was completely overblown by the way it's how poignant it is, how and how beautiful it is. So yes,
Sure.
it's definitely the same thing. However, you expressed
Absolutely.
it. If
Absolutely.
I don't know if I've answered your question. I've been
No, you have, and it's
many
I mean,
times.
questions are always open for interpretation. Naveen, you mentioned something which is really sort of it's brewing in my mind about the idea of, you mentioned you bring students from Kashmir to give them a sense of the other, a normal life. But here on our side, this is something that I often discuss when we look at our children today. It's like, how strange is their sense of normalcy, a normal life? There's something very, it could be something as simple as, you can probably, relate to this as well. Like when we go to a coffee shop, just for a coffee, and then there's like these armed guards standing outside. It's such a strange, jarring experience that I'm just buying a coffee. And yet the idea of having an armed guard fully with ammunition showing, there's something really abnormal about our normal as well. So I'd like to ask you about, like, how do you define what a normal experience is? I mean, obviously it varies from person to person. And I mean, how do you feel about that? Like, what are your thoughts on offering a normal life? Is it what your life is seen as normal, or do you feel like anything that is not upsetting, not violent, not sad is something that can be normal?
I think a little of all of that, but I should have qualified my apologies, because it's actually, the word normal is aspirational from the side of these young kids to their normal existence, which is what you described, and especially in Kashmir, which is constantly the common person is under siege. And within that siege, there are these young kids. Somebody wants to see a cricket match, which they can't, or want to see a so-called Bollywood film that they can't. They are not into questions of imposing something from the mainland, the rest of it, right? So they aspire to get out and do something simple like a cricket match, or all of that, which was denied to them. And so that definition of normal comes with the qualification that when you get them out here, you're sending them, they're staying with school children, a school adopts them. Sometimes they're in dormitories that the schools provide. They attend classes for those 3-4 weeks. They go to a simple thing like watching a film. We do theater and cinema workshops hands-on with them because we use the arts. So it's really, I guess, a kind of handloom way of addressing our frustration, certainly, at not being able to intervene or better lives in a way that I wish we could. We are not governments, but the moment something affects you or you have some kind of an interface with, essentially at the end of it, you're not trying to, there's no sort of top-down sympathy or compassion, and yet it is sympathy, it is empathy, it is compassion too. It's also reaching out, not out of anything else other than affection. That if we can, in a small way, do something, let's do it. And now even that has stopped. It's become impossible to get them to come, so for the last 4 years, certainly, it's been very, very fraught. Before the pandemic too, it just stopped.
See, all of this sounds so alien to me because Tayyaba, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. When we hear about things like the Hazara community and how they're suffering, it's almost impossible for us to even conceive the idea of asking them to come to Lahore and do something like that, or even sort of channel their grief through the written word. I mean, we've all sort of, come across their stories and the persecution that they face. We're all aware of it. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think it's our responsibility as, I suppose, writers? I mean, is it down to us to sort of help them channel their grief through the written word?
I think that's a very good question, but I do remember, I think we had a similar conversation once on this platform, because it reminds me of the whole question of representation. I'll ask again, can you hear me? I hope my screen hasn't frozen.
Anji,
No,
sorry.
absolutely.
Perfect.
You know, the burden of responsibility, because even if our intentions are noble, you know, how can we really speak for someone else? It'll be channeled, it'll be filtered through a very different lens, a very different voice. If we write for them, if we attempt to speak for them, yes, I mean, of course, we can just offer our venues, you know, open out that possibility or that encouragement for them to come forward. But it's never easy. You know, you can never find a black or white answer, because there are so many strings, so many tangles holding people back, their own family, not just society, their own families, or their own personal, their hesitance, or, you know, just so much involved in that. But I do want to come back to this later. But can I just ask Naveen one question? And this is perhaps moving away from this very, very deep, intense vein, but it's a question on form. When I started writing, it was through poetry. I was very young. I was a child, and now I've moved into prose. Yes, I mean fiction, short stories, a novel as well. But I still feel that I'm writing as a poet, because that's how I started out. But I also, maybe because of that personal reason, I feel that stories begin as poems. Stories begin as poetry, with that immediacy of image, of visuals, of musicality, and they're just there. You don't have to explain anything. Poetry is never meant to be explained or to even be analyzed. That's why, I mean, like, you know, just the fact that we are here talking about it, I mean, it's beautiful, but it's also it's a mystery. Like, what are we really handling? So, you know, and when people ask me, like, what are the stories that really influenced you, that impacted you, that shaped your writing, I always go back to the poems that I love, the poetry, and the stories I found in those ballads, you know, and there's so many of them. So, and there are these lines that have really stayed in my mind from your work. I hope I'm not making any error in repeating them, but the poet runs from his own words into the arms of a stray bullet. These are your lines. And then another, you write about a forest of sobbing trees where birds long for their cages. So the birds, you know, there's so many stories over there. So I'm just curious, did you ever experience like that conflict, or that you know, predicament of choosing? Should it be poetry? Should it be a story? Should it be a novel?
Yeah, I mean, you've actually hit many nerves simultaneously in the nicest possible way, or rung many bells or chords or whatever. First of all, the interesting thing here is that the word logic that often people seek, and I face this. I send you as a dear friend who's an ancient historian, like Pramila Thapa, for example, we correspond, we write to each other, and I send her a poem that she loves, and then the historian in her asks questions of logic and sequence, and, you know, so I keep saying that the opposite of logic is not illogical. The opposite of logic is magic. So children have that. And in my head, there are two things: that poetry allows me the freedom to roam in and out of the opposite of logic, right? In that sense. That's one. Two, the choice of doing poetry is actually a very mundane reason for somebody like me, because I wear so many hats. My average day is so unpredictable in the nicest possible way. Lots of things happen, some stressful, some beautiful, some full of ideas. Nothing is predictable. There is no routine to it, but it's fragmentary. And yet I insist on writing. I don't have a morning writing hour or a night or the act of, it's like this. It's like when I finish this and I'm stimulated by all this conversation, I just turn in the middle of all the conversation in the office around me, you just write something. So by nature, it becomes fragmentary. And for me, the fragment is not incomplete. It is complete in itself. It is what it is. It can be a poetic prose, so the form of what I do in the daily, I don't see myself ever writing. People keep telling me, hey, write a memoir, etc., etc. And I said, well, I'll have to put together all my 10,000 plus texts over these many years and call it a catalog of my fragments. And through that, you make an image of what we do. Because people think and assume fragment is a lesser form of art because it's something is to be completed one day. No, it is completed itself.
Yeah.
So in that sense, to me, poetry or a poetic prose or storytelling in the shorter form, if you like, works best. And I totally agree with every single insightful comment that you made about, the fact that what you approach your prose as a poet, in quite the way you approach your life, I'm sure, where you sense things under your skin. That's very important. And I can't describe it to people, that it is like a little drug, which you can feel the palpitation or the palpable nature of something in some line of poetry that, shakes you up. And so I guess that's about it.
Sure. Sure. Hamad, what are your thoughts about form? I know that you and I, when it came to Naveen's translation, we spoke about this, and I specified that this is a specific structure to his work, and this is something that I really wanted to sort of, communicate, that perhaps you might want to take that into consideration. What are your thoughts? Before
Hamad says anything, Hamad, you forgive my intrusion, but something that has affected me a lot was my first conversation with Hamad, where he said something which comes very simple to him in Urdu about free verse. He said, Azad Nazm. And since then, everything I think about is totally different. It's almost like that's the kind of epitaph I would like. It's really beautiful. Thank you. Hamad, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's the form that's the name we use in Urdu poetry for that sort of verse, and which has been used by Noon Mim Rashid or Faiz and a lot of other poets. But yes, in my own experience, I've whatever I have translated previously was more sort of fixed and bound in the in the confines of the form. For example, the classical form, you could call it in a way, or the more traditional sort of form, because I this is my first full book length project, but before that I have done fragments of translations here and there, and most of which were translations from classical Persian or Urdu poetry into English, or the other way. And it was usually ghazal, which is which goes in a very rigidly defined form. So yes, I really liked the challenge it offers, but also the freedom it gives. This the free verse and the Azad Nazm, and yes, so I've really enjoyed it, and I'm really loving it.
Fantastic. Hamad, if you could kindly recite, or Naveen, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. While waiting, we were waiting for the two of you to join, Hamad, and I were trying to sort of keep the audience occupied. So I suggested that I would read the first poem he's translated for me.
Go for it.
And then hear him say it. So this is from the section that says Street Full of Widows.
Yeah.
Across the barbed wire, bisecting the curfew, stand three women, their bodies covered in black. Only the red of the eyes guides them to graveyards. Covered in snow this month of August, foretelling the bitter winter. Watch the men run, die. Streets full of widows. Hamad, would you like to do
Thank
your
you.
translation?
Yes, with pleasure. And thank you very much for बेवाओं से भरी गलियां, खारदार बाढ़ के पार कर्फ्यू को चीरती तीन औरतें स्याही में लिपटी खड़ी हैं। उनकी आंखों की सुर्खी ही उन्हें रास्ता दिखाती है कब्रिस्तानों का, जो अगस्त ही से बर्फ में ढके शदीद सर्दियों का पता देते। मर्दों को दौड़ते देखो, मरते देखो, देखो उन गलियों को जो बेवाओं से भरी हैं।
Thank you. We backed and forth and we played around with in trying to discuss the possibility of dekho being repeated twice, then thrice. Dekho, so it was, because in the poem it may appear just once, but the way it says, mardo ko daurte dekho, marte dekho, dekho un galiyon ko jo bewaon se bhari hai. So I really thank you.
That's beautiful.
Well, thank you very much.
That was really fantastic. One of the things that struck me, and I think Sabine, I spoke to you about this, was, and this is just my interpretation, was during our communication, what I felt was happening was this, we often hear this, that, oh, we need to decolonize, we need to decolonize. And of course, here in Pakistan, there's a very strong movement against English being a mainstream language and this need to sort of bring forth indigenous languages and have more Urdu spoken. And I couldn't help but think that within that context, the communication between Naveen and Hamad, it felt like there was a decolonization process where you were taking work of English, and then Hamad obviously did his Urdu translation, and then Naveen, you added in your bit, and then Hamad went into Hindi. And I just kept thinking that it's fascinating to see how languages are sort of morphing and changing, and the connection that there is, especially when Hamad offered his translation in a language that you could understand and you could comment on, which was different from English. I just felt like this is sort of like a completely different path altogether compared to what we've done. And Hamad, perhaps you would understand, given how so much of our poetry has to be translated into English for people like myself, modern day Pakistanis, to understand. What were your thoughts on this? Did anyone feel the same, or am I the oddball here?
No, I think I said that from the beginning, that, and I've said this across even the other languages, that it's happening in here, is the liberty is the word I used, which you would understand. And that take liberty as a translator poet, make the work your own. And, of course, one can discuss things back and forth should it be needed. But on the whole, I would always defer to, even the way he added, we got rid of a word called sirf in the beginning, and Hamad just added he at the back and it at the end of the sentence, and it changes the emphasis because I hear things before I write them. There's a kind of, so I would probably, if I had not incarnated as a publisher in my 9th birth, I might have been a screenplay writer, because I love the idea of listening or creating dialogue of a certain kind. And so word images, one is accused often of creating word images, and I do take photographs. So there's a kind of nice, but in this case, even the process, you've hit a nerve about the decolonizing. That's fantastic, because the fact that this process appears to be already about azadi of a certain kind, to do things in a certain way, the process itself will slowly unravel, or as Sabine named, unravel our own grieving in a certain kind of way into the perfection that we seek.
I would just like to add,
Sorry, Taiba, go for it.
Okay. I just want to add, what we witnessed right now was just such a beautiful, fluid moment, when you were the text was communicating with its own self. It was protean. It was a process of becoming, right in front of our eyes, or right in front of our ears. I don't know what's the most appropriate thing to say.
Ek hi baat.
And ek hi baat, ears are nice. So, and language is such a strange phenomenon because it can be something so beautiful, something filled with such magic, with such mystery, because you don't know what you will discover about your own self when you speak another language. And we don't even realize it. We speak so many languages because there are some languages that we speak out of habit. There are some languages that we speak out of some kind of genetic inheritance, some by choice, some by interest, through the movies that we watch, through the music that we listen to. I mean, that, I won't just talk about Latin music because that is just so reductive and so limiting, but we listen to all kinds of music. We don't even have to really know the words or understand what they mean, but they just speak to us, right? So, and Meher, I know this is something you will really relate to because especially in a place like Pakistan, I mean, that's the kind of discourse I've been seeing around me so much. There's a lot of hostility, there's a lot of anger. Why are you writing in English? Why isn't it in Urdu? Why isn't it in Punjabi? Why isn't it in Saraiki? Why isn't it in XYZ? And all beautiful, lovely languages which must be celebrated. Yes, but why through that strange forced agenda? It's like, why are you made to feel guilty? Or why are you made to feel like some kind of cultural turncoat? So, yeah.
I always say, and it's a very unpopular opinion, that colonization happened. It's a reality. It's unfortunate or fortunate. That depends on your perspective. But it's very much a reality, and it's something that we should own. It's our history. But that's just my take on it. Ahmad, I see you nodding along. What are your thoughts?
Yes. No, I mean, in terms of choosing a language or a medium to express yourself, it should be, an honest thing. Something that speaks to you. If for example, writing in Balochi doesn't speak to me, personally, or something, just an example, I shouldn't do that just because people expect me to do that. But yeah, that's just my thoughts on that. But in terms of decolonization, I really like the fact that we were expressing in Hindi and Urdu, during our communication, and that was a really beautiful moment. But if you recall, Meher, I approached you last year about a few ideas,
Yes.
which I which I'm still thinking about, which were trying to translate some of the literary canon of written in Western languages, some of the corpus, for example, in terms of philosophy, which isn't available in Urdu and other regional Pakistani languages. So I was thinking about that. So it's always been on my mind, to be able to be able to bring the bring beautiful prose poetry, important, significant works of humanity to a wider audience in Pakistan and other regions. And I have worked on it, in a sort of informal way on social media as well. I try to do that. But yeah, that's a very important factor for me. That bringing something written in English or a Western language to into our
No, absolutely. I mean, recently there's another friend and colleague, Dr. Shiraz Dasti, and he had translated Gilgamesh into Urdu. And interestingly, he'd done it through the Pakistan Academy of Letters, a state institution of all places. And I was absolutely fascinated. Naveen, you'd like to read a poem in tribute to all of us? That's so kind of you. Please go ahead.
Oops. Okay.
Oh, not too quick. Do you want a minute?
No, I say.
Okay.
खोखले शब्द सूखे रेगिस्तान की याद दिलाते हैं, कमबख्त बढ़ती उम्र, बदलती हुई हाथों की लकीरें और चंद लम्हों की धुंधली याद के सहारे इस दिल को अब जनाब हम बहलाते हैं. You watch with fear your hands changing, even as you write. The veins more visibly furrowed, the skin less taut, folded, the fleeting freshness that has taken leave without saying goodbye. You feel dizzy at the thought that soon you will lose grace, strength. Collect then the voices and the words and the wind to show your friends these ghost traces. Thank you.
Oh goodness, that was so beautiful. Sabine, you're going to have to take over. I'm feeling very emotional.
Just wanted to share an observation with you, especially Naveen. I was, reading this, and just in the beginning, the introduction. I don't know what this is called. It's an introduction, but
It's a jacket text.
Thank you so much. See, I learn every day from you, Naveen. It says, he lays bare the nature of our outer and inner realities using striking symbolism to reveal what humans are capable of doing to each other. And while reading, and I've spoken to you about this, the juxtaposition of imageries, that has been really fascinating, transparent shadows, it's just, as a reader, I'm just interpreting, the darkness and lightness, and another thing that comes to my mind is the yin and yang. So many things, come to mind while reading your, I'm breathless reading your poem. So yeah.
I think we're at the end of our session now. So Naveen, thank you for
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Bahad.
who you are and for your work. Hamad, as always, you're one of the most generous people I know. Thank you so much for all that you do and for, putting up with all my voice notes as well on WhatsApp. Tayyiba, my colleague, my friend, thank you for always being there. And of course, Sabine, for being the powerhouse that she is and for being the way forward, being a trailblazer. Thank you so very much, each and every single one of you, for this most wonderful session.
One thing I wanted to say, Naveen, where can we get this book? I mean, I have it.
We know, some of us are waiting.
I've been gloating about it the entire time here, I know. But,
you can get it from me. Whoever wants it, I can send it. As long as couriers get there, I'm happy to send them, not a problem.
Yes.
Because we have an Indian edition. Yeah, please go ahead.
When will we be reading the Urdu translation? Hamad, aap bataएं.
It's a work in progress.
It's a work in progress.
Looking
very soon, hopefully, very soon.
Good. Inshallah.
It's interesting. The work is taking place, but I've yet to send out the contracts, which I will this weekend.
Okay, so now that we are talking, Meher,
we already have a contract.
I think you need to explain what is happening here.
Well, at the moment, what's happening is Hamad is working on the translation, and I just feel that one of the most important things was, and this is something I expressed, in numerous times to Hamad, was like, I really want you to get into the sentiment of things, and for that, I think Hamad's going to need his time and space. So I won't be bothering you with too many voice notes now, but you take your time in doing it. And Tayyiba, I look forward to having you be part of the launch here in Pakistan.
Absolutely. Goes without saying.
Of course. Okay. So that's where we are. That's it from my end. Sabine, anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's
all right. Thank you so
much. For a lovely conversation.
Thank you, Naveen. Thank you for doing this.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.